With the conquest of Ando territory over, an odd, almost unnatural silence fell upon Hokkaido. For the first time in many generations, maybe even in forever, the entire island was united under a single banner, although, in this case, said banner belonged to invaders from the other side of the world. The native Ainu celebrated this nonetheless. For the first time in ages, they tasted the sweet fruit of revenge, as their warriors finally scored a decisive victory against southern invaders, who exiled them to this northern barren island. In the south, the island of Nippon burned, torn apart by warlords fighting to replace increasingly weak Ashikaga shogunate. But in the north, in Akatani, peace could finally reign supreme, and the queen and her subjects could focus on finding a way to achieve their mission. And they had a lot of hard work ahead of them, because simply knowing that they had to return home wasn't enough. They actually needed a way to do it. Using floating pyramids of Akatani was out of the question. For one, they were already moored to the shore and formed the center of Akatani capital, so moving them out would simply be impossible. More importantly though, they were also, as refugees painfully learned themselves, very unreliable means of transportation, and in truth it was only thanks to sheer luck, or intervention of the gods, that any of these constructions actually made it all the way across the ocean. The Mayans also seized some Ainu ships during the war, but they were mostly short-distance coastal galleys that could not survive for long in open waters, and more importantly, most of them were converted into fishing ships to provide food for the growing colony, with a handful of them being handed over to scholars of Xibalba so they could pick them apart and, hopefully, use that knowledge to develop something more suited for oceanic journeys. So the scholars set off to work, but as you might expect, it was not an easy process, as it basically meant that people who never really traveled across the seas were suddenly expected to master the waves, and so it was clear that this will be a long, arduous task, filled with long hours of mostly failed experiments, conducted with desperate hope that somewhere, at the end of the road, Akatani would be able to produce a vessel that could actually float. Even then though, Akatani still needed a way to build such ships, which meant that entire dockyard infrastructure had to be established from the ground up, again by people who had no idea how to do it. Some of the officials recruited from the now annexed Ando clan did their best to help, but just like with the Ainu, ships of Nippon were mostly suited to coastal travels. Still, they could at least help with building simple dockyards, and while their knowledge certainly sped other projects up, Akatani still had a long way to go. But while these works proceeded very slowly forward, the Queen suddenly found herself once more accosted by the more conservative faction of the court priests, who, once again, demanded that she would return to her position as chief diviner and lead ceremonial sacrifices. Except this time, they had something a bit more sinister in mind. The wars against the Ainu and Ando clan might have been short and victorious, but unfortunately they were not won without losses. A number of soldiers lost their lives in battles, and many civilians were gone as well, killed by crews of Ando ships as they were raiding the coast. The result was easy to predict. There were quite a lot of orphans in Akatani, children who lost their parents to horrors of war. The Queen, bound by ancient laws, took care of these children, and while the task itself wasn't exactly expensive, it still tied a number of officials down, officials who could otherwise be used to accomplish other tasks. The priests knew that, and as they approached Queen Nayeli, they offered a solution. A blood of a child was a very powerful sacrifice, and so by offering these orphans to the gods, the Queen could achieve two goals at once. Firstly, she could show her gratitude to the gods for their support in winning these last two wars, and secondly, she could free her administrators and send them to deal with more pressing matters, like bringing Ando territories under control. The Queen, as you might expect, was appalled by the idea, but she also couldn't deny that the priest's logic in this case was surprisingly sound. After all, they said this would only help her with accomplishing her mission. And so, reluctantly, after several days of pondering all possible outcomes, Queen Nayeli, with heavy heart, broke the promise she gave to her father at his deathbed. She took the ceremonial obsidian dagger that she swore she would never raise against other human being and, in a bloody midday ceremony, plunged it into the heart of a young girl, while all around her other children met the same fate at the hand of her priests. Below the pyramid temple, the crowds cheered as, one by one, little bodies painted blue to mark them as offering to the gods fell silent. The ceremony lasted until sunset, and by the end of it, the stairs of Temple Pyramid of Akatani were covered in blood of almost 200 children. The crowds were ecstatic. The priests were content. The court officials departed to help with other tasks on this very night. The queen, with Prince Amik at her side, returned to her chambers and stayed there for over a week. And the gods? Well, perhaps they were watching. Perhaps they were even glad to receive such a glorious offering. Perhaps they did not care. But one thing is sure, very soon Akatani drowned in so much blood that even our ever-thirsty deities had to have enough of it. Because soon, dark predictions of Queen Nayeli turned out to be true. As months went by after the grim ceremony, she received more and more reports about southern warships moving along Akatani coast. At first, they stayed at a distance, but it wasn't long before news of first raid reached the court in the floating city, followed by dozens of similar reports. What's worse, instead of just pillaging coastal villages, sailors of Nippon also kidnapped many civilians, focusing especially on local chieftains and officials. A handful of these unfortunate souls managed to escape and brought with them even more troubling news. The southerners interrogated those they captured for intel, hoping to gain knowledge about Akatani military. It was clear then, after dealing with their own issues in the south, Clan Uesugi decided to expand its influence into Hokkaido, and these raids were nothing more but probing attacks that prepared ground for a full-scale invasion. The queen wasted no time. As soon as she was sure that the attack would come, she sent word to her forces to mobilize, and to her Ainu chieftains to gather additional horsemen, as the locals were known for their extensive use of cavalry, and so Akatani army needed a way to counter them. In the meantime, the army itself gathered on the southern coast of the island and deployed patrols all along the coast, hoping to spot and intercept the army that, by now, was most surely on its way. There was, unfortunately, no way to do anything else. With Uesugi warships constantly patrolling the strait, Akatani rafts and rowboats would be sent to the bottom of the sea within minutes, and so the only thing Mayan force could do was to wait and prepare defenses along the coast, even though no one knew where exactly their enemies would try to cross. Days went by, then they turned into weeks. Tension filled the air as War Chief Anakupech received no word of hostile invasion from his patrols. As was already established, he might have been an unwaveringly loyal officer, but despite his best efforts, not one truly skilled in warfare, certainly not like his predecessor was. As such, tension of these cold autumn days soon got to him, and the patrols sent along the coast became larger, but at the same time slower and less maneuverable, as their war chief's near-paranoid cautiousness was reflected in actions of his warriors. Because of that, when the news about incoming enemy ships reached Akatani commander, it was already too late to respond. By the time Mayans recalled their patrols and dismantled their camp, Uesugi army, led by one Yorishige Takeda, had plenty of time to disembark from their ships and establish a foothold on the island. Perhaps, if Akatani army was fast enough, it could have attacked their enemies while they were still disembarking from their ships, but because of War Chief Anakupech's indecisiveness, General Takeda managed to not only get all of his men ashore without issues, he even managed to leave the coast behind and move inland to meet Akatani force in an open field. Soon, first skirmishes erupted between Ainu horsemen and Uesugi mounted samurai, but these fights were mostly indecisive. Local raiders struggled to outfight the samurai in the open, but their light equipment and knowledge of terrain meant that they could run circles around southern scouts. But these fights were over soon, as both armies suddenly met themselves in a grassy valley several kilometers from Oshima Castle. Surprised to see so many enemies in front of him, War Chief Anakupech realized that this fight would be nothing like the one against Ando clan. These southerners were not only more numerous, it was also clear that they were better equipped and trained. What's more, they were also hardened by many campaigns fought against other clans, and so Mayan soldiers and chieftains, after few initial skirmishes, realized that they were severely outmatched. As such, War Chief Anakupech placed his men on the hill, hoping to utilize this defensive position to at least try to level the field, but General Takeda had none of that. He already had some knowledge about Akatani military tactics, mostly gained from Ando refugees who fled south after fall of Oshima and filled in the blanks during initial skirmishes. He knew that his force, though slightly outnumbered, was far better organized and trained, and so wasted no time and ordered his entire army to attack. Uesugi forces marched towards the hill, but instead of charging up, they simply drew their long bows and showered Akatani defenders with arrows. Mayan bowmen tried to respond, but their weapons lacked range of Japanese Yumi bows, and so they were forced to retreat after suffering heavy losses. Next, the war chief tried to chase enemy archers away with Ainu cavalry, but his horsemen were intercepted by samurai raiders and forced to retreat as well. Realizing that the situation was quickly deteriorating and unwilling to abandon his defensive position, Anakupech did the only thing he could. He ordered his entire force to charge down the hill, hoping that enemy archers would not fire at his men while they were locked in close combat with Uesugi main line. And so, Mayan warriors, howling like wild animals, rushed down the hill, demonstrating one advantage they had over their enemies: speed. Unaccustomed to horses and unburdened by heavy armor, Mayan troops were natural runners, and they charged towards Uesugi lines so fast that many of their archers failed to get away in time and were quickly dispatched by powerful blows of obsidian clubs. Yet, General Takeda kept his composure and ordered his main line to countercharge the Mayans, who were now out of formation after their wild attack. Soon, both lines crashed into each other and a mad melee ensued, with neither side gaining any significant advantage. Uesugi forces were better armed and organized, but the otherworldly sight of Mayan warriors scared many of their numbers, and so their advance was slow and cautious. Akatani warriors, on the other hand, threw themselves at their foes but, in most cases, were unable to break through their formations, and soon the battle between two lines became a bloody grind, with both sides losing hundreds of men without gaining any advantage over their foes. General Takeda tried to break this stalemate with his cavalry, but fast-moving Ainu raiders constantly threatened his flanks, and so he was unable to commit his samurai raiders into any serious maneuver. Minutes went by, then hours, and finally, as the sun began to set, both sides backed off, leaving behind a mountain of corpses between them, and retreated into their respective camps. The balance of that first day was grim. Uesugi forces lost around 1/3 of their infantrymen, over 2,000 soldiers, and over 300 cavalrymen. Mayans lost similar number of foot soldiers as their foes, but their cavalry, thanks to their superior speed, remained mostly intact. One could even say that, looking at numbers alone, the day ended with Akatani victory, but as Uesugi forces woke up on the next cold morning and prepared to continue the fight, they realized that the Mayans were gone. The war chief, as it turned out, decided that continuing this fight would be hopeless. He claimed that, this time, his foes would not be as intimidated by his warriors as on day one, and so, despite protests of many of his subordinates, ordered his force to retreat. What's more, he also claimed that the best way to continue the fight would be to fall back all the way to Akatan and link up with Ainu reinforcements there, to ensure that next time they could bring superior numbers against their foes. Was that decision justified? Was it logical? Or was War Chief Anakupech simply a coward who wanted to be as far away from his foes as possible? It's difficult to say for sure, but one thing is certain. His decision completely demoralized his remaining soldiers, and soon brought more death and destruction to his people than all their previous conflicts combined. Because, as was said, his decision caused his troops to completely lose faith in their commander, and the retreat, which was supposed to be an organized, controlled maneuver, quickly turned into a chaotic rout as groups of warriors broke off from the main column to return to their homes, while others rushed ahead to reach the floating city on their own. When the entire army finally arrived in Akatan, it was not a capable fighting force, but instead a disorganized mass of troops who were more interested in protecting their own homes than fighting for the rest of their nation, and many warriors and levies alike had to be coerced, threatened, or otherwise convinced to return to their posts. The queen also had a few choice words for her chief, as she was unable to understand what prompted his decision to fall back. From what we know, she was seconds away from calling him a traitor and a coward, but then remembered her own words about unity in times of crisis. War Chief Anakupech wasn't the most capable commander, true, but at this point he was all that the queen and the rest of Akatan had, and so, swallowing her anger, she kept him in charge and gathered the war council to figure out a new way to fight this invasion. Only problem was, General Takeda and his men were already on their way. After securing a proper foothold in the south of the island, Uesugi commander wasted no time and began pursuit of Akatani army, hoping to finish them once and for all, which would end the war in one swift strike. The Mayans knew that, however, and instead of waiting around, the army, with War Chief Anakupech backed by Prince Amik himself, retreated north to move out of harm's way. It meant that they would be leaving the floating city open to attack, but Akatani capital, built mostly on the sea and connected with the mainland by a handful of bridges, was not a place that could easily be stormed, and could withstand siege for many months, even with Uesugi ships running a blockade around it. As such, the plan was made. Mayan force would move to Xibalba, reorganized there, and look for an opportunity to counterattack. And such an opportunity arose mere few months later. After his force reached the floating city, General Takeda realized that his foes managed to evade him. He sent scouts in all directions, but once he learned about a new rallying point for Mayan army, the underground city of Xibalba, he quickly dropped all ideas about pursuing them. The reports he received described the place as an endless, unmapped maze of caves, which would take weeks or even months to fully secure, assuming, of course, his men wouldn't just all die in the process, as the place was a perfect defensive position that gave Akatani defenders almost unlimited opportunities to set ambushes. So instead, Uesugi commander decided to direct his forces against the heart of Akatan, the floating city itself, and started a siege. But truth was, he had no way to actually conduct it until the end. The plan of invading force was simple: destroy Mayan army in one decisive battle and then force their leaders to surrender. On the other hand, a prolonged campaign was doomed to fail, especially since invasion itself started in late autumn, and by the time General Takeda reached Mayan capital, the island was already frozen under several meters of snow. The winter in Hokkaido was not a pleasant time, and very soon forces of Clan Uesugi learned it the hard way, as their siege camp suffered from blizzards, snowstorms, and freezing temperatures. The weather turned out to be more dangerous than the primitives inhabiting this island, and the best option right now was to fall back, but because Akatani army was still at large, breaking camp and moving back to Oshima was out of the question. And so, General Takeda decided to keep the siege going, hoping that Mayans would break before his own troops did. Unfortunately for him though, the winter managed to do what Mayan war chief could not, and completely decimated his force. Hundreds froze to death in trenches around Akatan, and even more suffered from frostbite and hunger, as the island offered very little in terms of supplies. Ships couldn't reach them because the sea near the coast froze over, foragers were ambushed by Ainu raiders, and even supply convoys from Oshima stopped arriving after a while. When the spring finally came, the army that invaded Akatan was a shadow of its former self, demoralized, starving, and extremely close to breaking point. Yet, they held on, at least until the moment they saw Mayan force moving in from the west. While southern invaders froze to death in their siege camp, Akatani force kept itself busy. It marched south and took out few garrisons General Takeda left around Oshima, and, in doing so, also stopped all supply convoys from the mainland. Then, they waited until early spring and charged towards the siege camp, knowing full well that Uesugi army was already half dead. But warriors of Nippon once again proved their strength. Instead of panicking, Uesugi force broke camp, formed a wedge and charged straight at Akatani army, completely surprising both War Chief Anakupech and his warriors alike. Uesugi plan was simple: break through, no matter the cost. and the cost they paid was certainly high. The battle itself lasted for less than an hour, but during that hour around half of Uesugi's army was killed. But the breakthrough was successful. Akatani army was split in two by this surprising suicidal charge, and by the time their war chiefs got his men back in line, General Takeda and his soldiers were already fleeing to the west, leaving Mayans behind. The war chief ordered an immediate pursuit, but his men already broke ranks and started looking for highborn prisoners amongst enemy wounded, as sacrificing such mighty enemies would surely bring them favor of the gods. By the time war chief Nakupech got his men organized, Uesugi's force was kilometers away and there was no way to chase them down. Yet, the pursuit still happened, and some of Akatani forces, mostly Ainu raiders, managed to kill or capture a few hundred more Uesugi soldiers, but the majority of them managed to reach Oshima, where their ships transported them back to the mainland. In theory, it was a complete victory. The invaders were defeated and forced to retreat, and Akatan was safe. Mayans and their Ainu allies celebrated another victory against war-hungry southerners, confident that their position was safe. Unfortunately for them, Clan Uesugi was not done yet, and mere few months later, the invaders were back, and this time they knew exactly what they were getting into. In the first days of year 1460, Akatani war chief once again received news about large number of southern ships moving along the coast, and he ignored them, claiming that this was nothing more but another naval raid, thus, once again, giving General Takeda an opportunity to disembark his men without issues. That finally prompted Akatani force to move out, and two armies met mere few kilometers away from the valley they fought in before. Except this time, Yorishige Takeda knew exactly what to do. As before, he sent his archers to harass Akatani's center, knowing that his foes couldn't shoot back at his men. And, as before, War Chief Nakupech ordered his men to attack these archers, hoping to break them and demoralize his foes. But this time, Uesugi forces responded by their own countercharge, led by Takeda himself at the head of 800 samurai horsemen, and their charge completely flattened Akatani attacking force, decimating and breaking them in a matter of minutes. Seeing that his frontal detachment was obliterated, the war chief tried to reorganize his main line to repel the cavalry, but his formations were broken apart by terrified remnants of his front line, panicked and shattered by ferocity of Uesugi's charge. And the samurai used that opportunity without delay, storming into every breach as their infantry filed in behind them. Once more, Akatani force was split in two, and a mad, uncoordinated melee erupted in the center of the line, with both sides suffering heavy losses. The Ainu tried to use that opportunity to surround the Uesugi force, but were stopped by rearguard units that wielded long spears that were perfect against light cavalry. All the while, at the very front of Uesugi force, General Takeda pushed his men forward, and when his bloody detachment reached Mayan commander, it was clear that the battle was lost for Akatan. Nakupech took one look at the mounted samurai and the bloody path of corpses they created, another one at his disorganized warriors, and fled, leaving his men behind. It wasn't long before Akatani force realized that, and once that happened, a full-scale rout began, as entire groups of warriors threw down their weapons and fled in all directions. It should have been a slaughter, but Ainu cavalry was still mostly intact and managed to cover their retreat until Uesugi forces finally ended their pursuit after the sunset. Once again, the invaders were free to move into Akatani territory, but this time it was clear that they would not make the same mistakes as before. As Mayan warriors fled in terror back towards the capital, the panic spread around them, forcing local population to abandon their homes and flee into forests and hills, terrified of Uesugi revenge. But no such thing happened, because this time enemy forces ignored everything around them and focused on a single goal. Instead of spreading his forces around or trying to secure the island cautiously, General Takeda ordered his men to pursue Akatani army and force a final, decisive battle that would completely eradicate Mayan presence from the island, and allow Uesugi forces to steadily conquer it without distractions. And so, a mad pursuit began, with the end of Akatan never being as close as it was during these dark days. the war chief managed to reorganize remnants of his force around the floating city and once again tried to flee north into caves of Xibalba to regroup and reinforce there. This time, however, Uesugi troops were already in hot pursuit and managed to intercept Akatani force before it reached the safety of its underground caves. Unwilling to take part in another lost fight, the war chief ordered his men to split up, vanish into the hills, and continue the fight not as an army, but as guerrilla groups, hoping to harass invading force and tie them down in the northern part of the island, while the queen desperately mustered all relief forces she could find. And although that delaying tactic worked for a few weeks, in the end it was not enough to stop the invaders, and soon scattered, bloodied survivors of a grim campaign in the north started retreating into Ainu territory, leaving behind hundreds of dead. Unfortunately for them though, General Takeda and his men were constantly right behind them, hounding the retreating tribal force every step of the way, only increasing chaos and confusion within their already almost broken ranks. Day after day, grim news reached the court in the floating city, as messengers only brought news about constant defeat suffered by Akatani army. But the queen and her court were not willing to give up yet. While Uesugi force was busy chasing after her cowardly war chief and his broken army in the north and west, the eastern part of the island remained mostly undamaged, and the crown managed to organize some reinforcements, led by a new war chief, Kayom, a lesser noble who made a name for himself during the past few months by leading a mixed company of Mayan and Ainu soldiers that specialized in archery and hit-and-run tactics. Kayom had just around 1,000 men to his name, but with his talent for military command, Akatani court hoped that he and his men would be enough to tip the scale, and soon they were sent west into Ainu territories, with War Chief Kayom moving in ahead of his column to take command of what was left of Anakupage's force. The old commander gave up his position without fuss and was willing to accept Queen's judgment, an execution, but to his surprise, War Chief Kayom spoke in his defense. He argued that, despite suffering constant defeat, Anakupage managed to achieve a very important objective. He bled Uesugi army dry. By the time new commander took over, General Takeda's force was but a shadow of its former self, with only a handful of samurai raiders and less than 2,000 of exhausted infantrymen. The rest perished in the trackless wilderness of northern Hokkaido, picked apart by endless ambushes and raids. Old War Chief's men paid a heavy price for it, but in the end they achieved a major strategic objective and reduced enemy force so much that it was no longer capable of fighting. By the time these two bloodied armies met again, this time in Shiribeshi, General Takeda and his troops were exhausted beyond their stretching point, and after a few days of inconclusive skirmishes between two armies, they broke their camp and fled south in the middle of the night, and after a few days boarded their ships and fled back to the mainland, although by that time there were less than 1,000 of them left. Akatani perseverance has won again, but the victory was bittersweet at best, as thousands of warriors and civilians were lost to ensure this victory. And, what's more, the same thing already happened before, and there was no telling whether or not Uesugi army would try to cross the strait for the third time. And so, instead of celebrations, War Chief Kayom set his men to work, preparing a series of patrols and guard posts that would ensure that he would know about any invasion before giving his enemies a chance to set foot ashore. Except that third attack never came. Months went by, fortifications were built on the shore, patrols scoured the coast from east to west, and yet there were no reports of another attack, so forces of Akatan, kept in place by Uesugi warships, could only sit and wait. But, without even being aware of it, Akatan had one major advantage over Clan Uesugi from day one of their war, the ability to field reserves. It was true that Southern Army was composed of many experienced veterans of previous campaigns who could easily dispatch Mayan warriors. But the very same campaigns that built Uesugi power in the north of their island also almost completely depleted their reserves of capable recruits. When first invasion force arrived in Hokkaido, it was mostly composed of detachments of well-drilled but unexperienced recruits, led by a remaining handful of veterans. But with most of said veterans lost to freezing weather, the second invasion had to be carried mostly by mercenary troops, as the clan simply had no more men to send to fight. The remaining peasants were already overburdened and overtaxed, and forcing them into military service would mean that there would be no one left walking the fields. What's more, said peasants were already furious with their leaders. Pushing them any further could force them to raise up against their masters. And, unlike most peasant revolts in history, this one could actually stand a chance of winning, as their lord had no army to stop them. All that placed Daimyo Uesugi in a precarious position. Admitting defeat would make him a laughingstock among other lords of the nation, who would forever brand him as the daimyo who was defeated by club-wielding barbarians. But at the same time, the same lords were also greedily looking at Uesugi lands, hoping to conquer them. All this meant that, for now at least, the hostilities between North and South were suspended, although official peace was not signed. Both sides simply turned to their own affairs and licked their wounds, constantly keeping watch at the strait that separated them. Slowly but surely though, news about bad situation of clan Uesugi reached Akatan. Their southern neighbor was currently falling apart as their daimyo desperately tried to keep up appearances as a respectable, powerful warlord. His subordinates, however, thought differently, and a great number of people, including nobles, left Uesugi lands, seeking refuge in other territories. Most ventured to other clans, but some of these refugees, those who were either disgraced or otherwise unwelcome on the mainland, actually braved the blockade and reached Akatan itself. Most of them were unremarkable, opportunistic lesser nobility that hoped to keep their heads, but amongst those who fled to Hokkaido was one Norihiro Rokaku, a man who, by all accounts, was one of the greatest scholars of Nippon in his time, exiled from Shogun's court after some violent disagreements with the warlord himself. Disgraced on the mainland, he took the only option he could and fled north, first into Uesugi lands and then to Akatan, taking with him not only his knowledge but also some of his students and an entire ship full of books and scrolls that would very soon prove to be of immense value to Mayan settlers. Said books described many things: military tactics, theology, economy, agriculture, architecture, and dozens other topics, but they were still not as valuable as Norihiro himself, as he was more of a hands-on scholar. After presenting his ideas to the queen, he was quickly given an official position in the court, and soon set off to work to modernize every aspect of Akatani society he could think of, starting with building several forges that would manufacture metal weapons for Mayan soldiers. By now, some iron weapons were already in use, but these were mostly spears as they required little material by themselves. The forges, however, soon started producing other, more powerful weapons like swords. However, the blades produced in the floating city were not delicate, sophisticated katanas. Instead, they were tailored to Akatani army and resembled heavy, club-like cleavers with one cutting edge. Heavy, cumbersome, and extremely deadly, they looked like a bad joke when placed next to blades of Nippon, but for the warriors who were used to obsidian clubs, they worked perfectly. Soon, other armaments would follow, but the first step of modernizing Akatani army was already taken, and with every passing day, it grew more and more ready to receive another invasion. Except, as was said, that invasion never came. Mayan patrols on the southern shore of their island remained as vigilant as before, but as months went by, it became clear that Clan Uesugi was no longer capable of sending any significant force to Hokkaido. And, finally, in winter of 1464, over 6 years after the war began, a single ship landed on Akatani shores. In it, a handful of nobles who served as emissaries of Daimyo Uesugi who, after a short welcoming ceremony, presented their lord's offer of peace. And the offer was nothing. Hostilities would end and naval blockade of the island would be lifted, but other than that, nothing would change. The daimyo would not drop his claims and would surely return to Hokkaido again, so this peace was nothing more but a timed ceasefire. And yet, representatives of Akatan, instructed beforehand by their queen, took it. They even gave Uesugi delegation a masterfully crafted figurine made out of jade as a gift to their lord. The figurine was crafted by the queen herself, who then asked her priests to inflict it with a terrible curse that would bring misfortune to the person who received it. Whether or not it actually reached Daimyo Uesugi is unknown, but one thing is sure: the peace was signed, and that military contact with mainland Nippon taught Akatani and its queen a very valuable lesson. They could no longer live as their ancestors did back in their homeland. They were in a new, unknown world, and so they had to adapt to it as quickly and efficiently as possible, and they could no longer rely on luck as they did in their war against Clan Uesugi. Things had to change if Mayan people were to survive. Otherwise, as Queen Nayeli was sure, the next chapter of Akatani's story could very well become its final one.